All right, we might make a start. We've got the good fortune today to be joined by Genevieve Deaconos from AWC, and Jen's going to tell us about her work. Jen's the State Development Manager with AWC in Queensland, and she's going to tell us a bit about northern Bettongs and heritage wombats, and a bit more about AWC's mission.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for coming along today, especially with out there blooming. I appreciate everyone making the time to be here. I think you've probably got other things on your mind, so thank you very much. So before I kick off, I will just acknowledge the traditional custodians of Meanjin, which is the land that I'm on today and the land that I usually work on. And these custodians are the Turrbal and Yagara people. All across Australia and on many of the wildlife sanctuaries on which AWC works, traditional owners have a really long-standing and deep connection to the native wildlife, the waters and the country. And we're really privileged to be able to work alongside them in a lot of cases, to learn from them. And I really hope that as a society, we can start to adopt more of their perspectives when it comes to looking after this beautiful country. So a little bit about me. I did tell you a little bit in the kitchen earlier, but again, I'm Jen. I've been with AWC for just over 3 years, and my job is to look after all our donors and supporters in Queensland and to get out and talk to the community about our work, hopefully inspiring more people to get involved. I would be lying if I said I'm not a little bit nervous talking to you guys today. I'm not a scientist. I work pretty closely with a lot of our field teams, but my background is not in science or ecology. So please forgive me if I don't know all the answers to your questions. If you do ask a particularly curly question, I will write it down and find out the answers for you later. But again, you guys probably know a lot more about some of this stuff than I do. So please feel free to pipe up if you've got something to add as well. So first, I'll tell you a little bit more about AWC, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and what we do across Australia. And then I'll provide an update on 2 of our projects that we're working on here in Queensland. So I usually start my presentations with a few facts about mammal extinctions in Australia and get appropriate responses of shock and horror. But I won't bother today because I'm sure that you are all very aware of our track record in that regard. Most people know and agree that Australia is renowned for our incredible natural landscapes and our unique native wildlife. But not everybody knows that more than 80% of our plant and animal species are found nowhere else in the world. We live in one of the most biodiverse countries on the planet. And a lot of people don't realise, although I know that you do, that biodiversity is essential to our way of life. We depend on healthy, well-functioning ecosystems for food and water, for health, for climate regulation and cultural connection. But we are at very real risk of losing what makes this country so special. So this graph you will have seen before. You'll probably be quite familiar with it, and it is called the Threatened Species Index, presenting trends from long-term threatened species monitoring. And I like to include this graph because it really does show the unrelenting decline of about 3% every year in the abundance of our threatened bird, mammal and plant species. And it amounts to an overall decline of 61% from 2000 to 2020. So it's clearly quite shocking. And the primary causes behind this decline are feral animals, habitat destruction and introduced disease. The only areas where species are not declining at these rates are sites that are specifically managed for conservation. Elsewhere, the trend is really clear. But personally, I refuse to accept that more losses are inevitable. I refuse to tell my kids that we let these species go extinct on our watch. So this is what AWC is all about. So AWC's mission is the effective conservation of all Australian animal species and the habitats in which they live. To deliver on that mission, for the past 30 years, we've developed a practical approach to conservation that protects and restores our biodiversity. Across our network of sanctuaries, we protect some of the nation's most iconic and endangered wildlife, including 76% of our native mammals, 88% of our native bird species, and more than 50% of our frog and reptile species. So that's a pretty good collection. We want to ensure that these animals are effectively safeguarded for future generations. Today, AWC manages or works in partnership across 12.9 million hectares of Australia, so that's nearly 2% of Australia's land mass. We've got a dedicated team of ecologists and scientists and land managers looking after those 12.9 million hectares. We are looking for a land manager in Kimberley, as you heard. And we are a charity, so we're funded predominantly by private donations. Some of these properties that you can see on the map are owned by AWC, so we own them outright. Others are managed in partnership, either with traditional owners or government or private landholders. But what they've all got in common is they have AWC staff on the ground carrying out vital research, land management and conservation work. So we've got a pretty straightforward and practical approach at AWC. First, we establish those sanctuaries around Australia and we work at scale. So we purchase or partner with people who have really large properties. And we choose areas with diverse habitats across a broad range of bioregions to maximise the different species that we can protect. Then we get boots on the ground. We undertake practical land management for conservation, and that involves fire management, feral animal control, and weed eradication. But it's not just about protecting the habitat alone. We also take action to prevent imminent extinctions by delivering Australia's most extensive wildlife reintroduction program, reintroducing threatened or regionally extinct species back into their range, into large feral-free safe havens. And everything that we do at AWC is informed and monitored through world-class science. So looking after these massive areas of native habitat is a really big job, and it often starts with fire. So getting fire management right is crucial to managing a lot of Australia's landscapes, particularly across Northern Australia. Most of you are probably well aware of the concept of fire management and the benefits of good fire management. But for anyone who hasn't really heard of it before, it involves a regular schedule of cooler, patchy burns, usually in the early dry season, and it's really dictated by when conditions are right. The goal is to create a mosaic in the landscape of burnt and unburnt vegetation, so that ensures sufficient habitat and food remains for the native wildlife, encourages the growth of native plants over weeds, and it also reduces the fuel load early in the season. And that's really important, because reducing the fuel load helps prevent those really hot, destructive wildfires that can take hold when the land isn't managed correctly. So invasive weeds present another serious threat to our plants and animals. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the different weed varieties that we have in southeast Queensland, like lantana, which is the bane of our sanctuary manager up in Curramore. But we focus on removing weeds that have the greatest impact and restoring the native vegetation. So we really do focus on those weeds of national significance. We use a variety of methods to treat and remove weeds, including fire, targeted application of herbicide, manual removal, which is loads of fun. And we're always trying out some new and innovative methods to try and get rid of the weeds, like the injection of fungus into Parkinsonia, which is being trialled up in territory at the moment. Alongside fire and weed management, feral animal control is another way that AWC protects our native wildlife and their habitats. So feral herbivores like buffalo, goats, pigs, feral cattle, they degrade our landscapes, destroying habitat for native wildlife. Their hard hooves are particularly destructive around waterways. So we undertake the largest feral animal control program in Australia, and each year we remove thousands of feral herbivores from our sanctuaries. So this is Lake Gladstone. It's one of the largest permanent wetlands in the central Kimberley area, and it's a great example of the utter destruction that can be caused by cattle to a sensitive wetland area. So when we started working here, we excluded cattle and feral pigs simply by building a fence around the wetland. And it wasn't a complicated fence, it was very basic, just to keep our cattle under fence. Most of the other wildlife could still move through. But this is the result. So the wetland returned to good health over a 4-year period. It was helped along by a nice wet season, but you can clearly see the difference in the way that the land is recovering just by removing those herbivores. So while getting fire management right and removing feral herbivores is critical to improving ecological health across these vast landscapes. But while feral herbivores are bad for our native wildlife, feral cats are worse. So feral cats are still the single greatest threat to Australia's wildlife. A lot of people are surprised to learn, you guys probably aren't, but feral cats kill more than 2 billion animals every year. It's over 6 million animals each night killed by cats. Our research at AWC has indicated that effective fire management is really useful to reducing the hunting success of feral cats, so we do that. And we also know that baiting, trapping and shooting can help reduce their numbers, and it can relieve some of the pressure on the native animals. So we do that too, but it will never eradicate the cats completely. It just can't. So elsewhere, we are establishing a network of large fenced cat-free areas, and we are restoring locally extinct species into those fenced areas that cats can't get them. Part of what makes AWC different are these fenced feral predator-free areas. Some of our animals are so vulnerable to cats and foxes that they will only survive in places that are completely free of those predators. So the fences, has anyone ever seen one of the AWC fences? They're pretty impressive. They're about 6 feet tall. They're made of a special wire gauge mesh. They've got a skirt on both sides at the bottom. They've got 2 electric wires running through them, and they've got a floppy top. So there's no way cats getting through there. The areas they protect are huge, so they're usually thousands of hectares, and that means that the species they protect are still completely wild, so they've got all the resources they need inside that area. The fences are expensive to build and they're time consuming to maintain, but for now they are the best solution we have to protecting many of our native species from extinction. Just in case you weren't convinced, this is a camera trap image taken at our Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary in New South Wales. So on one side of the fence is a gorgeous little bilby, just living his best life. And outside is a hungry feral cat, just there. It's a bit hard to see in the dark. But without that fence, that bilby wouldn't stand a chance. I just love that photo because it's such a great illustration of why we have these fences. So we manage more cat and fox-free land than any other organisation on mainland Australia. And we currently have 10 feral-proof fenced areas, and we also manage Foray Island off the coast of WA, which is feral-free island sanctuary. Once we've built that fence, we undertake extensive feral animal eradication inside the fence and monitoring to make sure it's completely free of any feral predators, and then we're able to reintroduce those regionally extinct or threatened species. Our reintroduction program at AWC is focused on 3 things. 1 is taking action to prevent those imminent extinctions. Number 2 is rebuilding those large sustainable populations of threatened mammal species across multiple sites. And the 3rd thing is restoring the ecosystem functions performed by these animals. So a lot of them dig, they burrow, they turn over the soil, and those species play a really important role as ecosystem engineers. When we bring them back, we know the whole ecosystem benefits. So I'd like to share a great example of this reintroduction program in action. And it all happened up here at Mount Zero Taravale, which is located around 2 hours inland from Townsville. This is a northern bettong. Has anyone, I know some of you are very familiar with northern bettongs, but has anyone seen one in real life before? Yeah? Or one of them? They are gorgeous little native macropods. They're about 1 kilogram in weight, just over 30 centimetres long usually, with a tail about the same length again. And they are regarded as a keystone species, responsible for the dispersal of fungi across the forest floor. And that fungi dispersal is really important for the health of the dry sclerophyll eucalypt forests that they live in. So northern bettongs were once really common in Queensland, from the wet tropics right through to central Queensland, including on Mount Zero Taravale. But predation by feral cats, wildfire and habitat loss, and also cars, since European settlement mean that the species is now restricted to a very limited area. 2 years ago, fewer than 1,000 remained across only 2 locations. So the northern bettong was at really great risk of extinction, and the future of the species was hanging in the balance. So 20 years ago, when AWC first purchased Mount Zero Taravale, one of the reasons we chose that site was because northern bettongs had been recorded there in the past. But great, we'll get that property, we'll protect that piece of habitat and save that species there. But by the time we raised the funds to purchase the property, they were gone. It was a devastating blow, but we were determined to bring them back. In close collaboration with the traditional owners, the Department of Environment and Science, and members of the Northern Bettong Recovery Team, we all got to work. AWC began planning to construct a large fenced feral predator-free area on Mount Zero Tarravale in the area of habitat that was formerly utilised by the Northern Bettong. The first step was to work on restoring the habitat. So the property was previously privately owned and it wasn't managed for conservation, so we had a lot of work to do to get habitat right, especially that native grassy understory that the Bettongs need. So we did some regular fire management, weed eradication, we worked on suppressing feral predators. The fence itself was planned and constructed, and that was no mean feat. It's a massive area, it's 950 hectares, and it's, you know, it's the wet tropics, so it's up and down and all around. It had 30 creek crossings to navigate, so it was quite a feat of engineering. And then finally, 49 northern Bettongs were translocated into their new fenced and safe haven in 2023. So it was a massive project, and some of the AWC team that were working on this project had been working on it for the full 20 years before they were able to release those Bettongs, so it was quite an emotional journey. I would just like to share a short video of their release so that you can enjoy. Absolutely gorgeous. So after a reintroduction, AWC carries out some pretty comprehensive program of monitoring to ensure that the species is settling into its new home. And there's a number of thresholds that must be met to determine whether a reintroduction has been successful or not, including survival, body condition, and evidence of breeding. So we did use radio tracking collars like that one there on some of the animals, as well as an array of cameras and cage trapping at set intervals to conduct health checks. So a subset of 18 of the 49 were radio tracked for 3 months following their release in May. And post-release survival of the translocated Bettongs was really high. So 17 of the 18 radio tracked individuals survived to at least 3 months. The unfortunate 18th Bettong met a carpet python, which, you know, we're fine with. That's a natural process and a natural predator, and that's important to have as well. But the python was actually polite enough to cough up the radio tracking collar afterwards. That was very handy. Body condition on all of the Bettongs improved after release, with an increase in average body weight in founders trapped at 3 and 6 months post-release. So all going very well there. Evidence of breeding was obtained from trapping at 3 and 6 months post-release. So at 3 months, 15 of the 18 trapped females had pouch young, and at 6 months, all the females trapped had pouch young. So that's fantastic. And Consequently, all the short-term success criteria for the translocation were met. So that's more than 50% survival. We well exceeded that. Maintenance of body condition and more than 50% of females with pouch young. So that was a successful translocation in our opinion. So further monitoring last year in 2024 observed a high number of joeys and juveniles hopping around, demonstrating that the Bettongs are really happy in their new home and breeding like Bettongs. One other thing that we like to keep track of is how well the Bettongs are establishing across the range of habitat in their area. An exposure-wide cage and camera trapping survey at 6 months post-release showed that they had dispersed right across the feral predator-free fenced area, with a high detection rate noted in the northern and western extent of the area, which is just useful to understand which habitats they're preferring. So we can conclude that they're settling into their new habitat beautifully. You may not know that northern Bettongs create dens, so they use their pre-controlled tails to collect nesting material, and they've been really busy. You can see there that one's got a bunch of grasses in its tail, and that's the kind of nest that they create, which is really quite cute. We aim to build up that population of northern Bettongs at Mount Zero Caravel to around 400 or 500, like Click said in the video. And at that point, this particular enclosure will be our capacity. So after that, we can look at releasing some outside the fence and seeing how they go in the broader area of Mount Zero Caravel. We might reintroduce some to supplement the other existing wild populations in those other 2 locations, or we might put them back into a fenced area somewhere else. So we will just continue to keep building up that population. I should mention too that the reintroduction of the northern Bettong to Mount Zero Caravel and the construction of the fence was made possible thanks to grant funding and support from the Commonwealth Government's Environment Restoration Fund, the Queensland Department of Environment and Science, the Oak Foundation, WIRES, as well as donations from AWC supporters around the world. And it was a massive collaborative effort. And big thanks to the Northern Bettong recovery team as well. It really was a massive project, and we're very grateful to everyone that made it possible. And together, we've given this species a real chance of survival, so it's something to be proud of. Now, this is not a Bettong. This is another fascinating species that AWC is working to protect here in Queensland, the northern hairy-nosed wombat. Now, I don't know if many of you are the target market for Landline, but did anyone watch ABC's Landline on Sunday? Excellent. There's a little segment at the end about the northern hairy-nosed wombat and AWC's work there, and they've used 2 of the video clips that I'm using later in the presentation, so I'm glad you haven't seen them yet. So as I'm sure you guys know, there are 3 types of wombats in Australia: the common wombat, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, and the hairy-nosed wombat. So the northern hairy-nosed wombat once had a really broad range across 3 states, but it's now critically endangered. So that's the red area there on the map. That was its former range, and those 2 little red dots are the remaining populations. Only 400 animals now survive. And the tiny remaining populations are on only 3 sites in Queensland: Epping Forest, which is that northernmost dot, and Richard Underwood Nature Refuge and Powrunner State Forest, which are out near St George in West Queensland. So it's considered one of the rarest mammals in the world. Just to give you a little bit of context, we've got international support rallying behind species like the black rhinos or the giant pandas, but the northern hairy-nosed wombat is much more at risk. This is Richard Underwood Nature Refuge. The Queensland Government called on AWC to manage this property in St George in late 2023. So the refuge itself was established in 2009 by the Queensland Government's Department of Environment, Science and Innovation, and it's now managed by AWC. We'll play a really important role in the recovery of this species. So one of our first priorities is to learn more about their habitats, behaviours and their specific needs. So far, as well as looking after their habitat at the sanctuary through fire management and weed control, we've been monitoring the wombats really closely. And they can be, as you can imagine, really hard to catch. So we've had to come up with other ways to get information from them. We've conducted genetic surveys using a clever technique that collects hair samples from the wombats. So you hang double-sided tape across the burrow entrance, and you've got to get it at just the right height so that it brushes the wombat's back as he leaves his burrow or she. And it grabs some hair from the wombat, and then you can take that hair away for genetic analysis. And you know, being an ecologist can be so very glamorous. The team have also been busy collecting scat samples as a secondary DNA source. Fortunately, wombat poo's not too stinky and they tend to leave it in convenient little piles just outside their burrows, so it's not too hard to find either. So the scat and the hair samples are transferred to the University of Adelaide for analysis, and once complete, the DNA will provide AWC with some really rich information about the Richard Underwood Nature Refuge population of wombats, including the size of the population, the genetic diversity and the parentage of the offspring born at the refuge. So we'll also be able to identify breeding individuals, whether there are 1 or 2 dominant males, because we're not sure, and how many wombats are using each burrow. That's also really useful information. Everything that we previously knew about northern hairy-nosed wombats came from that remaining epi forest population. So it was quite a small little population limited to a really specific geographic area. So we need to know more about how they exist in other spaces. So recently we partnered with an organisation to use innovative ground penetrating radar technology to map the wombat burrows and understand how they might be a bit different to the ones that are up at Epping. So this research really did help us understand the depth and the structure of the burrows in different soil types. And we did find that the burrows at Richard Underwood are not as deep as the burrows at Epping Forest, and that's probably due to the different soil types. This is what the map looks like. Kind of looks like noodle soup, but it's data that's well versed, and it will be published by our team, I think, hopefully this year. It's really important information for us to have because at the moment we are searching for a new sanctuary, somewhere that will give the wombat population a bit more room to grow. Richard Underwood is only 130 hectares, which is quite small, and the population there is pretty much at capacity. So we are looking for a much larger sanctuary that we can acquire, where we can eventually translocate a few more wombats so that they can have the room to build up their population. Our climate change analysis actually shows us that Epping Forest is probably going to get too hot to support the wombats well into the future. So we really do need to find another place for them to go. And our search has been focused a bit further south. So we are looking into New South Wales now. That's a little bit of a map. The yellow dots are historical sightings and the red stars are sites that we've investigated where we had to do some soil sampling and other analysis to see if that's suitable habitat. So we're working on it, and I'm hoping that we'll have an announcement of a new sanctuary this year, fingers crossed, all going well. So keep your eyes out for that. In the meantime, we're still monitoring and we've got an array of cameras out across Richard Underwood Nature Refuge, and the footage has helped our ecologists discover a number of really interesting insights into the behaviour of the species. So sometimes these insights are useful for science and sometimes they're just really bloody entertaining. For example, we did discover that sometimes adult wombats will share a burrow, not breeding pairs, but just 2 female adult wombats, unrelated, just roonies. That one probably just went to the bath running or something. And then this one here. This is where a juvenile wombat encounters an echidna and decides to take up break dancing. It's graceful. They are a gorgeous species. There's so much more to learn about them, and all the data that we collect will be used to inform future conservation efforts. It's not just entertaining. So we'll continue to work really closely with the Wombat Foundation, the Queensland Government and other members of the Northern Hairy-Nosed Wombat Recovery Team to grow that current population to more sustainable numbers and hopefully to a point where they are no longer at such risk of extinction. So that's just 2 of the species that we're working on here in Queensland. We've also got some exciting research coming up with northern quolls, but I'm out of time, so I might give you that update next time. But thanks so much for listening. Did anyone have any questions at all?
Before we put out a question, I must say thank you for the talk. Thank you for the work that you do with AWC. It's extraordinary the results that you have, and also thank you for the support of the TSNs that AWC has had over the years. That data that you send us really is extraordinary, how the birds and populations that you have in this special service. Really critical information for us as well. Okay, over to questions.
Yeah, that's quite amazing and beautiful footage as well.
Yeah.
But Diana's probably going to answer this question, but I'll put it to you first, Jen. The exact cause of the decline, a million years ago, I was up in JCU and a colleague of mine did some kind of weather modelling of Northern Bettong and Rufus Bettong and showed that the climate sort of shifted so that it probably was unsuitable for Rufus Bettong, you know, for a brief period, but it fluctuated. But was there any further insight on the exact mechanism of why they declined out of Mount Zero Tara Vale?
Not to my knowledge. I know that part of the habitat at Mount Zero Tara Vale became unsuitable due to encroachment of rainforest. So just the way that land is not being managed, it didn't have fire through it. There was a lot of casuarina and woody thickening within the forests where the bettongs were, and that eradicated a lot of the grassy understory. So mismanagement of that habitat made it unsuitable for bettongs in some areas. So I know that played a role. I'm not sure what role climate played in that encroachment of the rainforest into what was previously dry sclerophyll. So I'm not sure exactly, but I suspect it had a role to play. But I'm sure there are people here in the room who could probably answer that question a lot better than I could.
Yeah, I can say that it's not completely clear. It's all in all the populations of fire management is really critical. But it possibly could also be cancer. Now, for Australia, no one really knows. Even all the other sites, it's very difficult to disentangle aspects of the habitat change and predators. Also dingoes, as well as cats. Yeah, they're just in an ecotone that's very narrow. It's very difficult to get a balance from.
And I know that the remaining wild population is adjacent to a road, and the regional ecologist based in Cairns has a pet peeve with this road because it's got a metal guard along the side of the road that was put there for the safety of motorcycle riders if they came off their bikes. But it essentially creates a funnel, and the bettongs that hop onto the road can't get off the road, and they have to hop down this funnel for a length of time, and they get hit by cars. So there was quite a bit of roadkill that was observed in that area that I think was quite needlessly tragic. So
That's that road to Marie River, the Dave Street River.
sorry, yeah. Just little things that chip away at a population that's already quite fragile. So I was lucky enough to see a Rufus bettong in Mount Zero Tara Vale when I was just there camping, and it's super cute. It's such gorgeous little creatures. It always surprises me when people have never heard of a bettong before. What's that? Oh, let me show you.
Sorry if you said this, but what were the main reasons for the decline of northern hairy nose wombat? There we go. Just like, do they suffer from mange as well?
So the populations that we're protecting don't have mange yet, so touch wood. They haven't been affected by that yet. We monitor for that to make sure that it doesn't somehow get into their population. But we're lucky so far. It's mainly habitat destruction, and they were hunted. So farmers don't like them because they make big holes, and they don't. And as we expand into agriculture and cattle trample the burrows, and so there's a lot of changes to their environment that would have driven their numbers down. And the population that was left up at Epping Forest was actually attacked by dogs as well, and that created a pretty severe dent in their numbers at one point as well. So that's one of their threats. Yes.
Yeah, I did my PhD in Central Queensland and from Mount Tara wallabies, and when there was two of these really threatened mammals in Central Queensland, brought the wombats to the others. In the mid-90s, there was about 30 of those wombats, and the thing that turned them around was fencing against dingoes. So they were eating their young. That then they just started to increase after they fenced it.
You look at that landscape and there's like miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. It's not a single tree, like broad scale growing out the world. It's you know, out of control. And Epping Forest is this tiny little postage stamp. But you look around and geez, I wonder why the wombats have declined over 90% of the range. There is just no habitat left across that band.
They're different to a lot of other species, so that they're when Europeans arrived, they were only in a very small area. They had already really defined, because they're very specific to a type of soil that they need for their burrows. And they were only in a couple of little spots. They were down in sort of southern New South Wales in that same sort of soil. They used to obviously be in just a little narrow strip from New South Wales to Queensland. They're only in spots. It's not like they were across the landscape.
Thank you.
They're very picky when it comes to their soil types. It's got to be the right combination of clay and sandy soil so that the burrows retain their structure. And then up at Epping, I think they build the burrows a lot around the roots of trees to sort of give them that extra structure because it's a bit sandier up there. And then down at Richard Underwood, they don't need that so much because it's got a bit more of the clay and soil, so they don't need to be under a tree.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yes. And
It's kind of related to what I said. What kind of relationships does AWC have with the neighbouring areas in some of those areas? So like Richard Underwood's only pretty small, it's surrounded by. Yeah.
Neighbourly relations is so important and it really does play a massive part in what we do, and a lot of our sanctuary managers dedicate a lot of time to making those relationships cordial wherever possible. It's really helpful for fire management because often you want to look at fire management across as broad an area as possible and coordinating that effort. So having good neighbourly relations for that is really important. And weeds again, like if you're controlling weeds on your property but the neighbour doesn't give a fig and their weeds keep coming across into your property, it's hard. So collaboration is super important. Some neighbours are friendlier than others. That happens everywhere, but mostly people tend to get on board given that we are there for the long haul. At Richard Underwood, that property, that surrounding property is owned by Eddie Underwood, and he also owns Richard Underwood Nature Refuge, and he put that land aside as a nature refuge protected under the Queensland government in honour of his son who passed away fairly young. So he still owns that surrounding area and he still owns cattle in that surrounding area. So relationship with him is pretty important too. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of brings me to my question about like land selection, and you said a bit about how you guys end up prioritizing where you might purchase new land. Can you say more about what goes into that process? Like, are you trying to expand existing areas more, or is it opportunistic? Maybe you could just say more about that process.
Yeah, and it's a massive process with lots of different factors that need to be considered. One is a pretty comprehensive map of bioregions and looking at we want to protect at least some or all bioregions under our remit and species distribution. So that's important as well. In terms of location, we want things that are accessible to our team, whether that's close to an existing town or close to an existing sanctuary. Sometimes that's taken into consideration. We've just nearly completed a body of work on our climate change modelling so that we can look at what areas might be suitable for species into the future, not just looking at former ranges, but what their future ranges might be. So that's driven a lot of our search for properties as well. And some of it's opportunistic, like some of it is when properties become available or when someone offers us the chance to partner in a property, we'll run it through a set of criteria that we've got and see if it matches where we're trying to go. But we do have a growth sort of focus. We're looking at growing another 3%, so to protect 5% of Australia's landmass is the big hairy audacious goal. So we'll see how we go, but definitely more properties is on the cards. You know of anyone who's got a nice chunk of land?
I don't.
It's getting harder and harder to come by. I think that's why we're focusing more on partnerships, because if we can find someone who owns the land who wants to manage it for conservation and partner with them in these long-term partnerships, that's great for everybody.
Looking at funding is from small donations, big philanthropy and requests.
Yeah, I can send you our annual report of what's available on the website, which will break that down a little bit more. But I think we've got around 80% of our funding is from philanthropic donations, and that's broken down into grants and major donors and smaller monthly donors. I don't know off the top of my head the exact split between them, but gifts of between 5 and 250k are probably the biggest slice of the pie, followed by grants. But yeah, all the donations in whatever shape or form are so important to us. We literally could not do this work without the donations that come in, because, you know, we don't receive any ongoing government funding, we only receive funding when we go for grants or if we're doing some community service work. So it's important to us that we can remain independent, and it's also important that keep motivating people to support the work. And hopefully that will happen more and more as people become more aware of how much biodiversity is important to human health and human lifestyles. Some people can be motivated altruistically by the good of doing something good and a love for nature, but I think realistically, for a lot of people out there, it comes down to what's in it for me. I think that the work that you guys are doing in discovering more about our animals and how we interact with them, how they interact with us, that's going to open up a whole lot of interest. I can get you more data on that if you're interested in going into that.
Just curious, with that photo where the builder was near the cat, I was just curious, like if the mammal populations inside the fences do reach capacity, is there a preference to move them to another fence location in case their predator, you know, they get a place at the door, there's just instinct and it wouldn't have affected, or is it better, like, or does AWC normally just, move them to another location outside of the fence?
So that's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack in there. So it will depend on the species and the numbers of the species that we have already. So if they're highly critically endangered and they're at great risk, then we probably wouldn't go releasing them outside the fence. We'd want to put them into another fenced area where they can build up to a safer number. Where the numbers are getting healthier, we will look at outside the fence translocations, and that's something that we're looking at a bit more this year. So we've already done some outside the fence translocations in Western Australia, our Mount Gibson Sanctuary with foals, Western foals. Yeah. So we've got a good population of them there, and we've released some outside the fence to see how they'll go in areas that are, we've got quite a lot of feral cat control, but they're not eradicated completely because there's no. So we're watching that to see how they go. If that goes well, and it has gone pretty well so far, then we'll look at putting out some bettongs, I think brush-tail bettongs outside the fence as well. And it does happen spontaneously sometimes. So the fences are designed to keep cats out, but they're not really designed to keep the animals in as much. So sometimes animals like bettongs or some of our phascogales and things will self-release, in which case that's fine. We tend to just let them go and see how they go.
Yeah.
But usually that only happens when they're quite healthy population numbers inside the fence. Ultimately, we would love to see the fences gone. Like that's the end game. You want no need for fences anymore. But that will rely on a long-term solution for feral cats, and that's still underway. Yeah. We're collaborating with the groups that are trying to develop a long-term solution to feral cats. And we've got some research work going on in the next few years that will help contribute to that. But yeah, the best case scenario, I think it's like at least 10 years away before we can roll out anything like a gene drive technology. And then they reckon their modelling says around 80 to 100 years before the cats are gone after that point for it to work its way through all the generations of cats. Yeah. So we'll need the fences for a little bit longer, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. No worries.
So let's quickly, Jen, about your strategies for engaging donors. So we had a seminar last week about the use of the role of art in operation. So yeah, I was just wondering about the sort of portfolio strategies you might use to gain donors and people.
Yeah. We use a huge range of different communication strategies. We've got a really good social media team that work on all different social media platforms. We've got a great PR person as well, who's really trying to get our work profile more in the news, and we find that's very useful. So where we've had big influxes of donors in the past, it's usually been following a great newspaper or anything that's made people aware of us and what we do and rally to the cause. We've also got a number of our sanctuaries that are open to the public for camping, and we find that's a really good channel as well. And that's another interesting conversation around access and the whole visitation concept and the balance of good and bad that comes with that. But we have found that many of our donors, and especially the major donors that have been with us for 20 years or so, they first found us when they were travelling through Kimberley, and they stopped in at Mornington and campsite. So our campsites are set up so that people can book online and visit and also learn a little bit about ABC and work that we're doing there. So that's a really good awareness raising exercise for us. We've got people like me in most states whose job it is to go out and do presentations like this. And so in the past, we've done a lot of Rotary clubs and aged care facilities and different groups who want to know more about the work. I'm not sure if that's one of our best methods, but it's certainly lots of fun.
Yeah.
Referrals is another thing that's really important to us. So our existing donors referring us to their friends or to their children, encouraging them to also donate. It's important. Speaking of art, because you mentioned the role of art,
Yeah.
we have had a program running for, I think it's been 10 years, where one of our board members is quite connected in the art world, and she invites a number of artists out to an AWC sanctuary, and they stay there for a few days and they create a piece of art in whatever medium that they work in. And then they come back and they auction off that art in a big exhibition, and all the proceeds raised go to AWC. And the plan was to do that for a number of years until $1 million was raised. They met that target last year, and so that was a big process, and it was only really possible thanks to her support, because she would fund the artists to go to the property. But it's awesome.
Yeah.
Some of the artwork's incredible. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, we might wrap it up. Join me in thanking Jen once again.